Ha, ha.
Shields and swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
In a lot of ways, Satan is one of the most mysterious characters in the Bible. It's not really certain who he is or what he's about. We have this popular culture sense of a devil who's got cloven hooves and horns and carries around a pitchfork, but that isn't the character who's depicted in the Bible. And in fact, the character depicted in the Bible is so complex that it's really difficult to determine what kind of character he is. And what Milton does in Paradise Lost is he takes this character of the devil and kind of gives him not just shape, but certainly for the beginning of the story, if not for the whole of the story, he really is the major character. And he turns him into what we normally talk about being the tragic hero. Satan is the tragic hero of Paradise Lost. At least he's perceived that way by a lot of readers. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today. So first of all, what do I mean when I say Satan is a complicated character? Well, what is probably the oldest book of the Bible, and if it turns out it's not the oldest, it is certainly one of the oldest, is the book of Job, Job. And I'm not going to read the book of Job to you, but I just want to give you a little bit from the very beginning of this. And this is in Job chapter 2. And in Job chapter 2, we have here in verse 1, "Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord." Sons of God is typically understood to be a reference to angels. So the sons of God, angels, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." So here we have something interesting, which is Satan shows up to hang out with God. He shows up with the angels. And this among them, it isn't clear if this means that Satan is considered one of them or not one of them. And so there are some understandings of Satan where he's more a kind of angel of death figure. That is to say, he certainly is not good for humanity, but he's someone who's doing a necessary job for God. In fact, the word Satan means accuser, and that essentially he's God's accuser in the world. And in the case of Job, God then literally says, "Hey, go check this guy out. What about him? He's pretty good." As if Satan is particularly an accuser against the good to make sure that they are as good in bad times as they appear to be in good times. So from there, it appears like Satan is kind of on God's side. He's on his team. He's someone who takes care of a dirty job that no one really likes, but a necessary job nonetheless. But for Christians, which Milton, the writer of Paradise Lost, there's more to this story, because we have the temptation of Jesus, and it's pretty long, and I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but this happens in Matthew 4, 1 through 11 is where Satan shows up and tempts Jesus. And Satan essentially gives him 3 different temptations, and each one Jesus responds to. And the there's a kind of subtext between this about how one would answer this if one were human, and what does it mean when Satan, who presumably knows that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus is God, is talking to Jesus and saying these things to him. It feels obviously very adversarial, and is very adversarial, right? As if Satan is in some sort of rebellion against Jesus, and that is to say against God. So it's a really complicated view, and there's other references to Satan, but they're really complicated. And then add to that, we've got some references to Satan which might not be references to Satan at all. A really famous one is Isaiah 14:12. In Isaiah 14:12, we get this one line, which I will read to you. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. And like a lot of Isaiah's prophecies, these kind of have two different reference, at least two. One of them is probably the king of Babylon. And the other one, who's the other one? Well, Isaiah is a prophet who often is used to show prophecies about Jesus. And there is a very strong tradition that this is a messianic prophecy. That is to say, this is a prophecy of the coming of Jesus. And you can sort of understand it, right? About the crucifixion of Jesus. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. But an early church father, Origen, so we're talking roughly a century after the beginning of the Christian church, he identified this. He said, no, I think this might be a reference to Satan, which is really interesting because the other reference it could be is to Jesus. Two very, very different figures. So Origen suggests that it's Satan. And that idea picks up steam, though it's not the only idea. By the way, the term morning star, in the way it gets translated, is Lucifer. That is to say, the name Lucifer doesn't really exist as a name for Satan in the Bible. There's a reference to this morning star, who the early church father Origen says is Lucifer, says is Satan. But that's an idea which Isaiah's Old Testament text for centuries had not been really put forward. And it's interesting that we now today, you can say the name Lucifer and people think, oh, you mean Satan or the devil. But it might be actually a reference to Jesus, not Satan at all. So Milton takes all of this complicated stuff and he makes this complicated character. And he makes a tragic hero. Now, what's a tragic hero? Well, if you look at, we get the term tragic hero from Aristotle in his Poetics, though to be clear, the Poetics is more, I think, descriptive than prescriptive. He's not saying this is how you should write so much as he's saying this is how the writing goes. And thus, if you want to write the normal way, this is how you would write. And he points out that there are figures that are tragic heroes and that their job is to elicit a kind of sense of, usually it's translated as fear or pity in the audience for the character, and that this character has to have a misfortune, and the misfortune has to be because of their own actions. It can't just be the character goes out and gets hit by a chariot. That's not good enough. The character has to be hit by a chariot because they are doing something that they're driven by, usually their own characteristics, to do. And the fortune has to go, you can't have good fortune. It has to be tragic. It has to go from good to bad, right? So how is Satan in Paradise Lost a tragic hero? Well, he certainly is the main character, and he has a kind of tragic loss, which is to say, as you go throughout Paradise Lost, you see Satan begins It's right after the fall, but he starts off reigning in hell almost from the beginning. And as Satan goes through different iterations, he kind of gets smaller and smaller from this kingly angel to shrinking down to like a serpent, and then finally, or like a toad creature, sorry, then like a serpent, and he's kind of diminished and diminished and diminished as the story goes. And as it goes on, we get several times where Satan gives these soliloquies where he talks about himself, and he basically says, yeah, I know what I'm doing is not good, is dangerous to me, not good for me, but I can't stop because this is my character. This is who I am. And so when we're looking at the character of Satan in Paradise Lost, I do think we do see him fulfilling the literary role of the tragic hero. Well, that's a strange choice for John Milton to make, because if you were to come up to me and say, hey, I want you to rewrite Paradise Lost, and I want you to write it so there's a tragic hero, who are my choices? Well, you couldn't do God, because God can't suffer misfortune, cannot change. The obvious answer is Adam or Eve, or the two of them together as a kind of interesting joint tragic hero, where through their own fall, we feel pity for them, and we fear for ourselves, and we recognize that they're driven to their fall by their own characters, and there is simultaneously nothing. They are aware of what they're doing, and yet they can't stop themselves from sinning, right? And thus falling. And there is some element of that in the characters of Adam and Eve. But if you said, my go-to certainly wouldn't be Satan, because why would I start off with Satan anyway? Am I supposed to feel pity and fear for Satan? Am I supposed to care that much about his motives when the Bible itself doesn't give us much, gives us so little actually about Satan's motives that it's not even clear exactly what his relationship to God is. He's obviously a created being, but why would God create this being, et cetera, right? So we just don't know. So why would Milton make this bizarre choice so that at the very beginning, the first few books, Satan actually feels like a heroic figure, a truly heroic figure, where you feel like, yeah, here's a guy who's going to do what he's going to do despite literally divine opposition, despite God himself being against him. And I think one of the things that he's doing here, which I come back to again and again, is really convicting the audience. Convicting the reader. When we read Paradise Lost, we're reading about someone who's not just a mysterious figure, but someone who's kind of like us. Someone who reasons in the way that we do. Someone who goes from literally being right there in God's presence to being cursed by God. And he does this knowingly, knowing what he's doing is wrong, knowing what he's doing is self-destructive, but he can't stop himself. And I think for the reader, when we see that, instead of seeing him as a mysterious figure, we see him as a familiar figure, probably as the self. Because who among us not just has done evil, but has done self-destructive things, knowing at the time that what we were doing was unwise and could be or would be self-destructive. It could be the tiny thing from eating the extra piece of cake that's not good for you, and you're thinking, I shouldn't do this, and you do it anyway. You're kind of driven to do it. To big things where you might have wrecked your life, at one point or another, based on some choices that you made, and you consciously knew that you were making them. And so to make Adam or Eve the tragic hero, in a way, is a kind of cop-out for us. We could say, like, yeah, but we were victimized by Satan. But when we see Satan as the tragic hero, and we recognize him, and we understand his impulses, we have to kind of say to ourselves, maybe Satan is me.